The key landed on the polished mahogany of the lawyer's conference table with a clatter that was both offensively loud and deliberately dismissive. It was a small, cheap thing of brass, attached to a faded plastic tag bearing the number 237. Clarice pushed it across the table with a perfectly manicured finger, her lips curled into a smile that did not reach the cold triumph in her eyes. "There," she announced to the room, though her gaze was fixed on the man opposite her. "That's the last of it. You can have the storage unit. All that junk your grandfather collected. Consider it a parting gift." Arthur looked at the key. He did not look at Clarice, his wife of 12 years, soon to be officially and irrevocably his ex-wife. He did not need to see the smug satisfaction on her face. He could feel it radiating across the table, a palpable heat of scorn. He could hear it in the way she said the word junk, drawing it out, loading it with a dozen memories of her derision for his family, his interests, his quiet, unassuming nature. Their lawyer, a man named Henderson who had the weary look of someone who had presided over the death of 1,000 love stories, cleared his throat. "So, we are agreed. Mrs. Davenport retains the primary residence, the vacation property in Aspen, the art collection, the portfolio of market securities, and the Mercedes. Mr. Davenport retains his personal effects, the 2012 sedan, and the contents of the storage unit number 237 at West Side Self-Storage, which both parties stipulate as having negligible value." "Negligible," Clarice repeated, savoring the word. "That's putting it generously. It's a fire hazard full of dusty books and broken furniture. But he was so sentimental about it." The theatrical pity in her voice was an artist's final, cruel brushstroke on a masterpiece of humiliation. Arthur finally reached out. His hands were steady. He was a man of quiet, deliberate movements, a trait that Clarice had once called reassuringly calm in the early days and infuriatingly passive in the later ones. His fingers closed around the small brass key. It felt cool against his skin. He slipped it into the pocket of his worn tweed jacket. He did not sign the documents with a flourish or a sigh. He simply wrote his name, Arthur Davenport, in the neat, precise script of a scholar. It was a signature that had authenticated academic papers and corresponded with the world's leading historians, a life Clarice had always considered a quaint but profitless hobby. She believed she had won. She believed she had stripped him bare, taking every symbol of their shared life, every asset that held tangible, marketable worth. She had taken the house he had painstakingly restored, the art he had chosen, the financial security he had quietly built while she cultivated her social standing. She had left him with what she saw as the dregs, a beat-up car and a locker full of ghosts. She thought she was leaving him with nothing. But Arthur knew something she didn't. He knew that in her arrogance, in her complete and utter blindness to any value that couldn't be displayed at a cocktail party, she had made a mistake. A colossal, life-altering, multi-million-dollar mistake. And the proof of it was now nestled safely in his pocket, a small brass key that was about to unlock a future she could never have imagined. Thank you for joining us for this story. We see stories like this play out in so many ways, in so many lives. If you have ever felt underestimated, if you have ever known your own worth when others could not see it, then this story is for you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and hidden strength. Now let's see how it all began. The disdain had not always been so overt. In the beginning, it was wrapped in the silken gauze of affectionate condescension. When Arthur and Clarice first met, she had been charmed by what she called his scholarly mystique. He was a doctoral candidate in history, his head full of forgotten battles and obscure philosophies. She was an art gallery assistant with ambitions that stretched far beyond the white walls of her current employment. He was the solid, intellectual bedrock she thought she needed. a man whose quiet intelligence would be an interesting accessory to the life she planned to build. She saw his potential not as a scholar, but as a project. "Oh, Artie, don't be silly," she would laugh, tapping a finger on the cover of a dense tome he was reading. Nobody in the real world cares about the economic policies of the late Ottoman Empire, but it's cute that you do. He would smile, believing it was a term of endearment. He didn't yet understand that for Clarice, cute was a synonym for unprofitable. His passion was a novelty, a curiosity she would occasionally present to her friends. "This is Arthur," she would say at parties. "He's brilliant. He can tell you anything you want to know about the Carolingian dynasty. Go on, ask him something." And Arthur, eager to please, would oblige, unaware that he was performing like a trained pet. The first true crack appeared during a dinner with her father. Richard Sterling was a man forged in the crucible of corporate takeovers, a titan of industry who measured a man's worth by the weight of his portfolio. He viewed Arthur's academic pursuits with the same puzzled contempt he might reserve for a man attempting to build a ship in a bottle. Over coffee and dessert, Richard leaned forward, his expensive suit creaking softly. "So, Arthur," he began, the tone avuncular but the question a blade. "Clarice tells me you're finishing this doctorate. What's the plan then? A little professorship at some sleepy state college? Chalk dust on your elbows for 40 grand a year?" "I have a few options, sir," Arthur replied calmly, though he felt Clarice tense beside him. "I do some consulting work for auction houses and private collectors, provenance verification, that sort of thing." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Side hustles. I'm talking about a career, a real one. You're a smart kid, I can see that. But you're aiming low. You can't build an empire on old books." Clarice had jumped in, her laughter a little too bright. "Oh, Daddy, leave him alone. He's happy in his little world of dust and dates." She squeezed Arthur's arm, a gesture that was meant to look like solidarity but felt like a restraint. The message was clear. Stay in your lane, be the charming but harmless intellectual, and do not challenge the real power at this table. The storage unit entered their lives a year into the marriage. Arthur's grandfather, a quiet, frugal man who had worked as a postman his entire life, passed away. He left Arthur no great inheritance, just a small life insurance policy and a paid-up storage unit. When Arthur and Clarice went to see it, the disdain was palpable. The unit was exactly as Clarice would later describe it, packed to the ceiling with cardboard boxes, old wooden chests, and furniture shrouded in yellowing sheets. It smelled of dust, old paper, and time itself. Clarice didn't even step inside. She stood at the threshold, one hand covering her nose. "My God, Arthur, he was a hoarder." "He wasn't a hoarder, Clarice," Arthur said, his voice tight. He was running a hand over a dusty wooden chest, a faint memory of his grandfather showing him a secret compartment stirring within him. He was a collector. He believed in keeping things. "He believed in keeping junk," she corrected. "What are we going to do with all this? It will cost a fortune to have it all hauled away." "We're not hauling it away," Arthur said, a rare note of steel in his voice. "It was his. It's mine now. I'll pay the monthly fee." It was their first real fight. To Clarice, his insistence was baffling, an irrational sentimentality for worthless objects. She could not comprehend that Arthur saw not junk, but a legacy. In those boxes, his grandfather had meticulously preserved a history, not just of their family, but of a changing world. Arthur had spent his childhood afternoons with the old man, listening to stories prompted by the objects in these very boxes. He knew, with an instinct that went deeper than logic, that there was more here than met the eye. He didn't know the specifics, not yet. But he knew his grandfather. He was not a man who wasted anything, least of all space. So he paid the fee, a small sum every month that became another point of contention, another piece of evidence in Clarice's growing case against him. It was the junk locker, her go-to example of his poor financial sense and his stubborn attachment to a past that had no glitter. It was the one thing he refused to yield on, a small patch of sovereignty in a marriage where his territory was shrinking by the day. In the weeks following the final signing of the divorce papers, Arthur moved into a small furnished apartment on the other side of town. It was the kind of place that was clean and anonymous, with beige walls and furniture chosen for durability rather than style. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling, architect-designed house he had shared with Clarice, a house where every surface was a statement and every room was a stage. To any outside observer, it was a dramatic and pathetic fall from grace. Clarice certainly saw it that way. She made sure of it. Her social media, once a curated gallery of their shared glamorous life, became a testament to her newfound freedom. There were photos of her clinking champagne glasses with friends at rooftop bars, captions reading, "To New Beginnings," and "Cutting Out Toxic Energy." There was a video of her directing movers who were rearranging the living room furniture, the subtext clear. She was erasing him piece by piece. The final, most pointed barb came via a text message a month after the divorce was finalized. It was a photo of her, smiling radiantly, standing in front of the house. The lawn was perfect, the flower beds bursting with color. Below the image, a single line of text: "Hope you're doing okay. The house misses the way you used to take care of the garden. But don't worry, I've hired someone." It was a masterclass in passive aggression, designed to remind him of everything he had lost and to frame her as the benevolent, concerned party. She was not just the victor. She was a gracious one. Arthur looked at the photo on his phone, the pixels glowing in the dim light of his Spartan apartment. He saw the new expensive landscaping service she must have hired. He saw the carefully staged happiness. He felt a pang, not of loss for the house or for her, but of a deep, weary sadness for the man he had been, the man who had tried for so long to earn the love of a person who was incapable of giving it. He did not reply. He did not rage or despair. He simply set the phone down, put on his old tweed jacket, and took his car keys from the simple ceramic bowl by the door. He drove, not with anger, but with a quiet sense of purpose, through the city streets until he reached the industrial park on the west side. The rows of corrugated metal doors gleamed under the afternoon sun. West Side Self-Storage. He parked the sedan, its engine ticking as it cooled, and walked to Unit 237. He slid the small brass key into the lock. It was stiff from disuse. For a moment, it resisted, and Arthur felt a flicker of irrational fear. But then, with a satisfying clunk, the mechanism turned. He lifted the heavy roll-up door, the screech of the metal echoing in the sudden cavern of space he had created. The smell hit him first, that unique perfume of old paper, dry wood, and captured time. It was the smell of his grandfather's house, of his own history. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was just as he remembered, just as Clarice had described it. A fortress of boxes, stacked high and deep. A chaotic jumble to the uninitiated eye. But Arthur's eye was not uninitiated. He stepped inside, the door rolling down behind him with a final, definitive thud, plunging him into a dusty twilight. He didn't need much light. He knew the geography of this place by heart, a map etched into his memory from a dozen visits over the years. He navigated the narrow pathways between stacks, his hand brushing against cardboard and canvas. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, not yet. He was simply reacquainting himself with his kingdom of junk. He stopped before a large, sea-worn wooden chest in the back corner. Kneeling down, he ran his fingers along the side, feeling for a familiar imperfection in the wood. He found the small knot, pressed it, and heard a faint click. A narrow panel on the side popped open, revealing not a secret compartment, but a simple recess. Inside was a small, leather-bound ledger. It was worn, the cover soft as felt. He pulled it out. It was his grandfather's. Arthur had seen him writing in it many times, but the old man had always been vague about its contents. "Just keeping track of things," he'd say with a wink. Arthur opened it. The pages were filled with his grandfather's elegant, looping script. It wasn't a diary. It was a list. Dates, names of companies, number of shares, purchase prices. Names that were now legendary. Apple Computer Inc., Microsoft, Intel, Oracle. Purchased not in the 2000s, but in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Tiny investments made with the meager savings of a postman who had an uncanny faith in the future. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He had always suspected, but he had never known for sure. His grandfather hadn't just been a collector of things, he had been a collector of opportunities. He closed the ledger gently. A sacred text. This was the heart of it. He placed it back in its hiding spot and then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. He didn't scroll through social media. He didn't look at the photo Clarice had sent. He opened his contacts and found the name he had added a week ago, on the advice of a trusted university colleague. Evelyn Reed, Esquire, a specialist in asset litigation, known for being ruthlessly sharp and meticulously prepared. He pressed the call button. "Ms. Reed," he said, his voice calm and clear, echoing softly in the chamber of forgotten treasures. "It's Arthur Davenport. I believe it's time we scheduled a meeting." Clarice floated through her new life on a cloud of self-congratulation. The house felt lighter, brighter, now that it was purged of Arthur's solemn books and his quiet, disapproving presence. She hosted a divorce-anniversary party, a glittering affair that served as both a celebration of her freedom and a public declaration of her victory. Her father, Richard Sterling, was the guest of honor, holding court by the newly renovated fireplace. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," he boomed, raising a glass of champagne that cost more than Arthur's monthly rent. "You finally shed the dead weight. A man's got to have ambition, drive. He was an anchor, that one. A pleasant one, I'll grant you, but an anchor all the same." Clarice smiled, a perfect, polished smile that had been her primary social tool for years. "He was a dear, in his own way," she said, the manufactured magnanimity making her feel even more powerful. "He just wasn't built for this world." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, the successful people, the effortless luxury that she believed was her birthright. Her friends, women who operated in the same stratosphere of status anxiety, murmured their agreement. They spoke of Arthur as if he were a distant, unfortunate relative who had passed away. It was easier than acknowledging he was just across town, living a life they considered beneath notice. But beneath the shimmering surface of Clarice's triumph, tiny, hairline cracks were beginning to form. Arthur, in his quiet, methodical way, had managed everything. He had balanced the checkbooks, paid the army of contractors and service providers, and navigated the complex web of investments that funded their lifestyle. Clarice had always assumed this was a simple, trivial task. She was quickly discovering it was not. A notice arrived from the city about a property tax assessment that was unexpectedly high. The pool maintenance company sent an invoice with a surcharge she didn't understand. The quarterly statement from her new financial advisor was a confusing jumble of figures that seemed, alarmingly, to be smaller than the last one Arthur had shown her. These were minor annoyances, gnats buzzing at the edge of her perfect picture. She swatted them away with irritation, making calls. her voice sharp with an authority she was discovering not everyone was inclined to respect without Arthur's name attached to the account. The first real tremor came in the form of an email from the Aspen Property Management Company. A minor plumbing issue had, due to a delayed response, become a major one. A pipe had burst in a wall, flooding the downstairs guest suite. The estimated repair cost was staggering. Clarice stared at the number on the screen, a figure that would have been a rounding error in their old joint accounts but was now a significant chunk of her liquid assets. Annoyance curdled into fury. This was exactly the kind of tedious, expensive problem Arthur would have simply handled. He would have known who to call, would have probably argued the price down, would have dealt with the insurance. Now it was her problem. She paced the length of her marble kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear as she was put on hold by the insurance company. It was in this moment of supreme frustration that a memory surfaced. A small, recurring charge on their old credit card statements. West Side Self-Storage. $45 a month. A pittance, but it was the principle of the thing. He was still squatting on marital property, in a sense, and she was paying for it, indirectly or not. The thought solidified. A hard little diamond of an idea. She would make him deal with his junk. It would be a small assertion of her continued power, a way to vent the frustration that was building within her. She hung up on the hold music and found his number in her contacts, still saved under Arthur. Meanwhile, across town, Arthur and Evelyn Reed sat in her minimalist office, a space as clean and precise as her legal arguments. Spread across the glass conference table were not dusty artifacts, but crisp, notarized documents. The original divorce decree. A signed affidavit from Arthur detailing every conversation about the storage unit. And at the center, a certified appraisal report from a trio of independent experts. Evelyn, a woman whose youth belied a formidable intellect, tapped a pen on the final page of the appraisal. The number at the bottom was breathtaking. They confirmed the authenticity of the stock certificates, she said, her voice betraying a hint of awe. And the valuation on the first edition collection of Enlightenment philosophy is conservative, in my opinion. Mr. Davenport, your grandfather wasn't just a postman. He was a financial visionary with a penchant for vellum. He just believed in holding on to things he thought had merit, Arthur said simply. And you held on to this information, Evelyn countered, looking at him with newfound respect. You let her walk away with what she thought was everything, knowing you had this. That took restraint. She made it very clear what she valued, Arthur said, his voice flat. She valued the house, the art, the cars. She called the contents of that unit junk in this very document. He gestured to the divorce decree. She stipulated it had negligible value. I simply agreed with her assessment of her own priorities. Evelyn's phone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from the tracking software she had placed on Clarice's public social media accounts. A new post. A picture of the Aspen house with a frustrated caption about homeowner headaches. It seems Mrs. Davenport is discovering that assets also come with liabilities, Evelyn noted with a wry smile. The house is a money pit. The market is down, and her spending habits are prodigious. She's going to get squeezed. And when people like her get squeezed, they look for someone to blame, and someone to pay. As if on cue, Arthur's phone, sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate. He glanced at the screen. The name Clarice glowed back at him. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Showtime. Arthur took a deep breath, the quiet before the storm. He let it ring twice more, a small, silent act of reclaiming the power to respond on his own terms. Then he answered, "Hello, Clarice." The call from Clarice came, as Evelyn had predicted, when her frustration had reached its peak. Her voice, usually modulated for social pleasantries, was thin and sharp, stripped of its usual charm. "Arthur, I've been calling the insurance about Aspen, and it's a complete nightmare. Did you know our premium went up? Of course you didn't. Anyway, that's not why I'm calling." A pause, as if she was recentering herself for the true purpose of her call. "I was going over some old statements, and I realized we are, or rather, I am, still paying for that storage locker of yours. It's not much, but it's the principle of the matter." Arthur remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. He was sitting in Evelyn's office, the lawyer watching him with a keen, analytical gaze. He pictured Clarice in their old house, a house that was now just hers, pacing the pristine floors she had fought so hard for, agitated by a $45 charge. The irony was a bitter medicine. "It's time you cleared it out, Arthur," she continued, her tone shifting from accusatory to impatiently magnanimous. "Frankly, I'm doing you a favor. It's ridiculous to keep paying for a room full of trash. I need the account closed, so go down there, hire some people, and have it all hauled to the dump. Send me the bill for the movers. I'll be generous and cover it." Here it was. The bait. Delivered with the same casual arrogance that had defined the end of their marriage. She wasn't asking, she was commanding, and she was doing it under the guise of helping him, of freeing him from his own sentimental folly. "That's very thoughtful of you, Clarice," Arthur said, his voice level and calm. Evelyn gave him a subtle nod of approval. The game was afoot. "Don't be sarcastic, Arthur. Just get it done. I want that expense off my books by the end of the month." "The thing is," Arthur said, pausing as if considering a complex problem, "it's a lot of stuff. It would take me a while to sort through it all myself, and I wouldn't want to just throw everything away without checking. Some of it has sentimental value." He used the one phrase he knew would trigger her impatience. A sigh crackled through the phone. "Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills, Arthur, a lesson you seem determined never to learn." "Fine. What do you propose?" "Why don't we meet there?" he suggested. "This Saturday. We can go through it together, one last time. You can point out what you're absolutely sure is trash, and I'll arrange for its disposal. That way, there are no misunderstandings." There was a beat of silence on the other end. He could almost hear the calculations in her mind. On one hand, the idea of spending a Saturday in a dusty storage unit was appalling. On the other, it ensured the task would be completed to her satisfaction, and it offered one final opportunity to supervise him, to confirm her superiority. The desire to manage the situation, to be in control, won out. "Fine," she clipped. "Saturday. But I have a luncheon at 1, so it needs to be in the morning. 10 o'clock. And I'm not lifting a single box, Arthur. I'll point. You'll handle it." "I'll handle it," he repeated softly. 10 o'clock it is." He hung up the phone. Evelyn Reed leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. She took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. "She thinks she's the one holding the fishing rod," Arthur said, a wave of melancholy washing over him despite the impending victory. He was setting a trap for a woman he had once promised to love and protect. "In this kind of litigation, Mr. Davenport, there are no innocent parties. There are only the prepared and the unprepared," Evelyn stated, her voice firm, pulling him back from the edge of sentimentality. "She wrote the rules of this engagement years ago. You're just finally playing by them. Now let's go over the sequence for Saturday. The key is to let her humiliate herself as much as possible before we lower the boom. The more definitive her dismissal of the contents, the stronger our position becomes." Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. He thought of the dinner with her father, the years of quiet condescension, the final dismissive flick of the key across the table. This wasn't about revenge. Evelyn was right. This was about preparation. He had spent 12 years being underestimated. On Saturday, that underestimation would finally be called to account. He spent the next few days in a state of quiet anticipation. He went to the university library, losing himself in the familiar scent of old books and the hushed whispers of academic pursuit. It was his sanctuary, the world where he was not poor Arthur, but Professor Davenport, a respected mind. He was preparing not just a legal confrontation, but a closing argument on his own life. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of brilliant autumn day that Clarice would have insisted they spend at an outdoor brunch. Arthur dressed simply in jeans and a durable work shirt, but he wore the same tweed jacket. In its pocket, he had the small leather ledger. He arrived at Westside Self-Storage at 9:30. The air was cool, the long shadows of the morning painting stripes across the asphalt. He went not to Unit 237 but to 241, 2 doors down, which Evelyn had rented the day before. She was already there, dressed in a sharp pantsuit that seemed comically out of place. Inside the empty unit, she had set up a small table with a thermos of coffee and a file of documents. A single, powerful recording device sat next to them. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be," Arthur said. "Remember," Evelyn coached, "let her talk. Let her dig the hole. Your only job is to hand her the shovel. I'll be in here. The recorder is on. The door will be cracked just enough to hear. When the time is right, I'll make my entrance." Arthur nodded. He walked to Unit 237, slid the key into the lock, and rolled up the door. He stepped inside and, with deliberate care, pulled a single, medium-sized cardboard box from a stack near the front. He placed it on the ground in the middle of the concrete floor. He opened the flaps. It contained a few old, leather-bound books and a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. He sat on an overturned crate and waited. At precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek black Mercedes SUV pulled up, its engine a low, expensive purr. The driver's side door opened and Clarice emerged. She was a vision of casual, costly elegance. She wore white designer jeans, a cashmere sweater the color of cream, and sunglasses that hid half her face. She looked less like someone arriving at a storage unit and more like someone observing a minor inconvenience from a great and protected distance. "Arthur, honestly," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous alley of metal doors. She did not approach the unit, but stood several feet away as if the dust might be contagious. "Do you have to look the part so completely? You look like you're about to clean out a barn." "Good morning, Clarice," Arthur said, his voice even. He remained seated. "Thank you for coming." Her eyes swept the dark interior of the unit, a look of profound distaste on her face. "Let's just get this over with. What is all this?" She gestured vaguely at the towering stacks of boxes. "Is there anything in here that isn't flammable?" "A few things," Arthur said. He gestured to the open box at his feet. "I thought we could start here." She peered forward, crinkling her nose. "Books? Of course. More of your dusty, worthless books." "Arthur, I don't have time for this. Just call the disposal service. I'll even authorize the payment on my card. It will be my final gift to you." This was the moment. The final, unequivocal dismissal. The certification of worthlessness from her own lips. "Are you sure?" Arthur asked, his voice soft but carrying a new weight. He looked up at her, his gaze steady and clear. The sun caught the edge of her sunglasses, momentarily blinding him. "This is your last chance, Clarice. Once it's gone forever. I want you to be absolutely certain that you want no part of anything in this unit, that you renounce any and all claim to its contents." She let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated derision. "Renounce my claim? Arthur, what on earth are you talking about? What claim could I possibly want to a pile of rubbish? Yes, I am sure. I am 100% unequivocally absolutely certain that the only thing in this locker I want is for it to be empty. It's worthless. All of it. Just like... She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air between them, as heavy and foul as exhaust fumes. Just like you. The unspoken words were louder than anything she could have shouted. All right then, Arthur said, a strange calm settling over him. It was the calm of a captain who has weathered the storm and now sees the clear, open water ahead. He reached into the box. Since it's all worthless, you won't mind if I just dispose of this. He pulled out a book, its leather cover cracked with age. This is a first edition copy of Voltaire's Candide from 1759. There are only a handful of these in the world in this condition. The last one that came up for auction sold for about $20,000. Clarice's dismissive posture stiffened. She took a half step closer, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. What? Arthur placed the book carefully on the ground and reached back into the box, pulling out the bundle of letters. And these, he said, his voice retaining its measured academic tone, are a series of personal letters from Thomas Jefferson, discussing agricultural theory with a contemporary in France. They've never been published. A collector I know would probably pay $50,000 for the set. Maybe more. To a museum. He let the figures hang in the air. $70,000. A sum that was no longer a pittance. A sum that would have more than covered the repairs on the Aspen house. Clarice's mouth opened, then closed. The color was draining from her face, leaving her expensive makeup sitting on a canvas of shock. That can't be right, she stammered, finally walking to the threshold of the unit, her pristine white jeans now perilously close to the dusty concrete. She stared at the items on the ground as if they were snakes. You're making that up. Am I? Arthur asked quietly. He looked up at her, his expression not of triumph but of profound, sorrowful judgment. You lived with me for 12 years, Clarice. You knew this was my field. You knew my grandfather collected these things. Did you really think my life's work, my family's passion, was all just junk? The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. The foundation of her reality, a reality in which she was the savvy, successful one, and he was the pitiable, impractical dreamer, was beginning to fracture. And the earthquake had only just begun. Arthur hadn't even gotten to the ledger yet. Clarice's mind, a sharp instrument when it came to social calculation and asset acquisition, was now sputtering, trying to reboot. She stared at the book, then at the letters, then at Arthur's calm, implacable face. The world had tilted on its axis. What she had perceived as a pile of trash was suddenly a treasure chest, and she had just, with her own signature and her own words, thrown away the key. But her instincts, honed by years of prioritizing self-interest, kicked in. Greed, a more powerful force than shame, surged through her. Wait a minute, she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old command. Wait just 1 minute. If that's true, if those things are valuable, then they're marital property. We acquired them during the marriage. That means half of it is mine. She took a confident step into the unit as if to physically reclaim her stake. Her entire demeanor shifted. The pity was gone, replaced by the flinty-eyed focus of a predator who has just realized her prey is not dead after all. In fact, she continued, warming to her new theme, I'm glad you brought this to my attention, Arthur. It seems you weren't entirely forthcoming during the settlement. Hiding assets. My lawyer will have a field day with this. It was a masterful pivot, from dismissive arrogance to righteous indignation in under 30 seconds. She was already rewriting history, casting herself as the victim of his deceit. Actually, a new voice said, crisp and clear, cutting through the dusty air. "Your lawyer will have nothing." Evelyn Reed stepped out from the shadows of the neighboring unit. 241. She held a tablet in one hand and moved with an unhurried grace that was more intimidating than any show of force. She stopped just outside the unit, creating a triangle between herself, Arthur, and the stunned Clarice. Clarice whirled around, her face a mask of confusion and fury. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm Evelyn Reed," she said, her voice cool and pleasant. "I'm Mr. Davenport's legal counsel, and I was just enjoying the morning air while I listened to you, Mrs. Davenport, explicitly and repeatedly renounce any claim to the contents of this storage unit." She tapped her tablet. "It's all recorded, of course, for clarity." The blood drained from Clarice's face. She looked from Evelyn's implacable smile to Arthur's quiet sorrow. "This is a setup," she whispered, the accusation lacking any real force. "No," Arthur said, speaking for the first time since Evelyn's arrival. "This is a clarification. You had every opportunity, Clarice. For years. You could have asked about my grandfather. You could have shown a flicker of interest in my work. You could have read the divorce settlement you were so eager to sign." Evelyn stepped forward, her heels clicking on the asphalt. "Your signature is on page 14 of the marital settlement agreement, Appendix B, Item 7. It explicitly lists the contents of Storage Unit 237 and stipulates, at your insistence, that they are the sole property of Mr. Davenport and are assigned a value of negligible to zero. You didn't just agree to it, Mrs. Davenport. You championed it. You used it as a tool of humiliation. Now you want to claim it was a hidden asset? The court will be very interested to hear a recording of you just minutes ago, calling it a pile of rubbish and ordering it to be hauled to the dump." Every word was a nail in the coffin of Clarice's hopes. But Arthur wasn't finished. The books and letters were just the opening act. It was time for the finale. He stood up, walked to the old sea chest in the back of the unit, and knelt. He pressed the knot, opened the hidden panel, and retrieved the small worn ledger. He walked back to the front of the unit and held it out. Not to Clarice, but toward the light. "The books are a hobby, Clarice. A lovely and, as it turns out, profitable hobby," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer. "But this is the legacy. My grandfather, the postman, the man you dismissed as a hoarder, had a theory. He believed in the power of communication. In his day, it was the mail. But he saw what was coming. He saw a world connected by wires and signals." He opened the ledger. "So every month, for 20 years, he took a small amount of his paycheck and he bought stock. He didn't buy blue chips. He bought small, unknown companies that he read about in obscure magazines. Companies with names like Apple Computer, Microsoft, Intel. He bought them when the shares cost pennies. He never sold. He held the physical certificates, and he stored them along with a complete record right here." He turned a page, showing a neatly pasted stock certificate with a rainbow-colored Apple logo. "This is what you called junk, Clarice. This is what you were so eager to throw away." He didn't need to say the number out loud. Clarice, who had spent her life surrounded by wealth, could do the math. The dawning horror on her face was terrible and absolute. The books were an insult. This was an apocalypse. The air crackled with the sound of her world collapsing. The $70,000 was a forgotten footnote. This was millions. Not one, not two, potentially more. An empire built by a postman, cataloged by a scholar, and thrown away by a socialite. "No," she breathed, the word a tiny puff of disbelief. "No, it's not possible." "It is," Arthur said, closing the ledger with a soft, final sound. "And it's all mine. You made sure of that." The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. She had come here as the queen, granting a final audience to her vanquished subject. Now she was the beggar, standing in the dust, realizing she had willingly, happily, traded a kingdom for a handful of trinkets. The silence that followed Arthur's revelation was a living entity. It filled the space between them, thick with the weight of shattered illusions and catastrophic miscalculation. Clarice stood frozen, her face a pale, slack mask. The name Microsoft, spoken in that dusty, forgotten space, had detonated in her mind, obliterating the triumphant narrative she had so carefully constructed for her life. Then, the dam broke. The first sound was a choked sob, a gasp for air in a world that no longer had any. "No," she repeated louder this time, shaking her head as if to dislodge a terrible dream. "No, you can't do this, Arthur. This isn't fair." The appeal to fairness from her was so absurd it bordered on high comedy. Evelyn Reed almost smiled. "Fairness?" Arthur's voice was weary, devoid of triumph. "Was it fair when you mocked my grandfather's memory in front of our friends? Was it fair when you told me my work was a cute hobby that embarrassed you at dinner parties? Was it fair when you stood in this very spot 12 years ago and called his life's possessions junk? You have lived by a code of surface value your entire life, Clarice. This is simply the final accounting of that philosophy." Her breakdown accelerated, moving from denial to pleading. "Arthur, please," she cried, tears finally tracing paths through her expensive foundation. She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched. "We can fix this. We can go back to the lawyers. We can redo the settlement. I made a mistake. I was angry. I was hurt. I didn't know." "That's the entire point, Clarice," Arthur said, taking a step back, away from her touch. "You didn't know. You never wanted to know. You had no interest in anything you couldn't immediately appraise and display. This wealth doesn't exist because of a stock tip. It exists because a man with very little money had immense vision, and because his grandson respected that vision enough to protect it. It is a wealth built on character, not on calculations. You have no claim to it." Her pleading turned to rage, a wild, cornered animal's fury. "You tricked me. This is fraud. I'll sue you for everything you have." It was at this moment she seemed to remember she wasn't alone. She spun on her heel and jabbed a trembling finger at Evelyn. "And you ambulance chaser! I'll have you disbarred." Evelyn didn't flinch. "On what grounds, Mrs. Davenport? For advising my client to secure his legally assigned assets, for documenting your own legally binding statements. My advice to you, as a professional courtesy, is to stop talking immediately. Every word you say is making a potential future litigation even more unwinnable." Clarice seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had appeared. She fumbled in her purse for her phone, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She speed-dialed a number. "Daddy," she sobbed into the phone. "Daddy, you need to get down here. Arthur, you just need to get here now." She rattled off the address, her voice a desperate, childlike wail. Arthur watched her and for the first time felt a flicker of something akin to pity. He saw not the formidable social adversary, but a woman whose entire identity was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. While they waited for the arrival of Richard Sterling, Clarice paced back and forth on the asphalt, a caged panther in cashmere. She shot venomous looks at Arthur, who had retreated into the cool shadows of the unit, and at Evelyn, who stood calmly checking her email on her tablet. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the low hum of the nearby highway. 20 minutes later, a black Cadillac Escalade screeched into the facility, parking at an aggressive angle that blocked the lane. Richard Sterling erupted from the driver's seat. He was a big man. used to filling boardrooms with his presence, and he brought that same energy to the narrow alley of storage units. He was dressed for the golf course, but his face was stormy. "What in God's name is going on here?" he bellowed, striding toward the scene. He saw his daughter's tear-streaked face, and his gaze immediately locked onto Arthur. "You? What did you do to her?" "Daddy, he's been hiding money from me," Clarice cried, rushing to his side. "Millions, from his grandfather. He let me think it was all worthless junk." Richard's eyes narrowed. He processed the information instantly, translating it into his native language of assets and leverage. "Is this true, Arthur? Did you conceal assets during the divorce?" Before Arthur could speak, Evelyn stepped forward, placing herself directly in Richard's path. She was a foot shorter and 100 pounds lighter, but she met his belligerent stare without an inch of ground. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice dangerously pleasant, "I am Evelyn Reed, Mr. Davenport's counsel. Perhaps you should ask your daughter about Appendix B, Item 7 of the settlement she signed, the one where she formally relinquished all claims to the contents of this unit, which she herself valued at 0. Richard looked from Evelyn to his daughter, a flicker of confusion on his face. "Clarice, I didn't know what was in it," she wailed. "He never told me." "A crime of omission is not a crime if there was no duty to disclose, Mr. Sterling," Evelyn continued smoothly. "Your daughter's derision for her husband's family and intellectual pursuits is a matter of public record among their social circle, and now, thanks to this morning, a matter of audio record. A judge would call that willful ignorance, not fraudulent concealment. Your daughter wasn't tricked. She was tested, and she failed." Richard Sterling was not a man accustomed to being lectured by anyone, let alone a young woman in a pantsuit. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "I don't know who you think you are, little lady, but my lawyers will tie you and your pathetic client up in court for the next 10 years. We will drain his precious little inheritance with legal fees. By the time we're done, he'll wish he'd just given us our half." It was a classic strong-arm tactic, the one he had used to crush countless business rivals. But he wasn't in a boardroom, and Evelyn Reed was not a rival. She was a predator who had smelled blood long ago. She smiled, a thin, sharp smile that did not reach her eyes. "Please, try it," she whispered, the words carrying an astonishing menace. "File the suit. My firm specializes in countersuits for frivolous litigation and malicious prosecution. We would also, during discovery, be intensely interested in your own financial dealings, Mr. Sterling. Specifically, the transfer of certain assets into your daughter's name in the 6 months prior to the divorce filing, a move clearly designed to shield them from the marital estate. It's called fraudulent conveyance. It carries civil penalties and, in some egregious cases, criminal ones. Your daughter's financial records are about to become her worst enemy, and by extension, so are yours." The threat landed with the quiet devastation of a perfectly placed charge. Richard Sterling froze, his bluster evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. He had been outmaneuvered. He had walked into a legal minefield, and this woman held the map and the detonator. He looked at Arthur, who was now standing at the entrance of the unit holding the ledger. He saw not the weak, intellectual son-in-law he had always despised, but a man who held all the cards. The tableau was stark. Clarice, weeping in the arms of her suddenly powerless father. Evelyn, a silent sentinel of legal dominance. And Arthur, the underestimated scholar, standing at the mouth of his treasure cave. He calmly reached down, pulled the roll-up door, and with a deafening screech of metal, shut it, plunging the contents back into darkness. He slid the padlock into place and clicked it shut. The sound echoed down the alleyway, a final, metallic full stop. He turned, gave a slight nod to Evelyn, and walked toward his modest sedan, leaving Clarice and her father standing in the dust of their ruin. The weeks that followed were a study in contrasts. For Arthur, they were filled with a quiet, focused activity. He and Evelyn worked with a team of financial advisors and historians to formally liquidate and diversify the astounding portfolio his grandfather had built. The initial estimate of $2 million proved to be conservative. After the final accounting of the rare books, the historical documents, and the astonishingly valuable stock certificates, the estate was valued at closer to $7 million. Arthur moved out of his temporary apartment and into a beautiful but understated brownstone in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. He didn't buy a new car or flashy clothes. His first major expenditure was a multi-million-dollar endowment to his alma mater to create the Walter Davenport Chair in Historical Economics, a tribute to the postman who saw the future. For Clarice, the weeks were a slow-motion collapse. Her life, which had looked so glossy and perfect from the outside, was a house of cards built on the foundation of Arthur's steady management. With that foundation removed, the whole structure began to wobble. The cost of running the massive house, paying for the landscaping, the pool service, the property taxes, and the disastrous repairs in Aspen began to eat away at the liquid assets she had claimed. Her father, Richard, after a furious initial consultation with his own legal team, confirmed what Evelyn Reed had told him. They had no case. Worse, any legal action would open their own finances to a discovery process he was unwilling to risk. He advised Clarice to cut her losses and tighten her belt, advice she was emotionally and practically incapable of following. Her frantic calls to Arthur went unanswered. Her texts, which ranged from pleading to threatening, were met with a wall of silence. He had instructed Evelyn to handle all communication. Evelyn's response to Clarice's lawyer was simple and brutal. Mr. Davenport considers the matter closed. The news of the reversal of fortune spread through their old social circle like wildfire. The story became a piece of modern folklore, whispered at cocktail parties and charity galas. Clarice, once the queen bee, became a figure of pity and morbid curiosity. Her friends, whose loyalty was pegged to status, began to distance themselves. Invitations dried up. Calls went unreturned. She was no longer the triumphant divorcee. She was the woman who had fumbled a fortune, the punchline to a very expensive joke. The breaking point came 2 months after the confrontation at the storage unit. The house, her grand prize, became her prison. Unable to afford its upkeep, she was forced to put it on the market. But the market was soft, and the house, with its bespoke customizations, was difficult to sell. The carrying costs were bleeding her dry. The life of effortless luxury she had envisioned was a mirage. One evening, driven by a desperation that had stripped away her last vestiges of pride, she did the one thing she had sworn she would never do. She drove to Arthur's new neighborhood. She found his brownstone easily. It was the one with the impeccably restored historical details, something she would have once called fussy. She stood on the street for a long time, watching the warm light glowing in the windows. Finally, she walked up the stone steps and rang the bell. Arthur opened the door himself. He was not surprised to see her. He looked calm, dressed in a simple sweater and slacks. He had been reading in his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books. Not just the valuable ones, but all of them. "Clarice," he said. It was not a question. "Arthur," she began, her voice small. "Can I come in?" He hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. He led her not into a formal living room, but into his study. It was a room that was the purest expression of him. Comfortable, intelligent, and peaceful. A fire crackled in the hearth. The air smelled of old books and lemon tea. It was everything her stark, modern mansion was not. It was a home. She stood in the center of the room, looking lost. She had planned a speech, a new appeal, but the quiet dignity of the room, of him, disarmed her. "The house is for sale," she said bluntly, the words tumbling out. "I can't afford it. The Aspen place is a disaster. Richard won't help me. He says I made my bed." Arthur listened without expression. He gestured to a worn leather armchair by the fire. "Sit down, Clarice." She sank into the chair. For the first time in a long time, she looked her age. The carefully constructed mask of glamour was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a woman facing an abyss. "I came here to ask you for help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I was awful to you. But I am begging you, Arthur. I have nothing. You took everything." The old accusation, delivered now not with spite, but with pathetic desperation, hung in the air. Arthur leaned against a bookshelf, his arms crossed. The moral mirror was about to be held up. "I took nothing, Clarice," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I took what you threw away. There is a difference." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and began the quiet recitation of grievances, not as a prosecutor listing charges, but as a historian stating facts. "For 12 years, he began, I tried to share my world with you. Not the world of money, but the world of ideas, of history, of passion. When I wanted to talk about a book I was reading, you would pat my hand and say, 'That's nice, dear,' before changing the subject to the new caterer you wanted to hire. When I brought home a small, fascinating artifact I'd found, you would ask where we could put it so no one would see it. When I expressed joy in my work, you expressed concern for my earning potential." He walked over to his desk and picked up a framed photograph. It was of a smiling, elderly man in a postman's uniform. His grandfather. "This man," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed, "was the kindest, wisest person I have ever known. He taught me that wealth is not what you have, but what you can give. He taught me that history is not a collection of dates, but a collection of lessons. You called him a hoarder. You dismissed his entire life's work as junk. You did it not just once, but hundreds of times, to my face and behind my back. You didn't just disrespect his memory, Clarice. You disrespected the very core of who I am." He put the photo down gently. "You say I took everything. But the house you're selling, I restored it with my own hands before we had the money to hire people. The art collection, I curated it, piece by piece, from artists I believed in, long before they were famous. The financial portfolio you thought was yours. I built it, slowly and carefully, with the knowledge you dismissed as useless. You didn't want a partner, Clarice. You wanted a financier and a house manager. When you thought I was no longer useful in those roles, you discarded me." Tears were streaming down her face now, silent and shamed. There was no argument to be made. Every word he spoke was the unvarnished truth. "So no," he concluded, his voice softening again, "I will not give you money. To do so would be to validate the very philosophy that destroyed our marriage, the idea that money can fix anything, that it can be a substitute for respect, for kindness, for love. It would be the final insult to my grandfather's memory." He walked to the door and opened it. "You are not without resources, Clarice. You are intelligent and capable. You have a degree. You can work. You can build a life for yourself, a real one, from the ground up. Perhaps then you will finally understand what worth truly means." She stood up, her body trembling. She looked around the warm, book-filled room, at the life he had built not from the ashes of their marriage, but from the solid foundations he had possessed all along. She saw, with devastating clarity, everything she had lost. It wasn't the $7 million. It was the man who stood before her, a man of substance and integrity she had been too blind to see. She walked out of the door without another word, leaving him in the quiet comfort of his well-earned peace. A year drifted by, marked by the turning of seasons against the brownstone's windows. Arthur's life settled into a rhythm of purpose and contentment. The Walter Davenport chair was filled by a brilliant young historian whose work was changing the way the world viewed economic history. The foundation he started began its first project, the restoration of a local library that had been slated for demolition. He taught a single, oversubscribed seminar at the university, not for the money, but for the joy of it. He was not a recluse, but his life was private, rich with genuine friendships, quiet intellectual pursuits, and the deep satisfaction of using his fortune to create value rather than to display it. The ledger and the certificates it contained were now in the hands of professionals, but the book itself sat on his desk, a constant reminder of his grandfather's quiet wisdom. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur was walking through a small city park near his home, a book in hand. He stopped to buy a coffee from a street cart, and as he waited, his eyes fell upon a woman sitting on a nearby bench. She was dressed in a simple professional uniform, that of a well-known downtown catering company. She was arranging canapés on a tray with a focused, efficient air. It took him a moment to recognize her. It was Clarice. She was thinner. The expensive, high-maintenance shell was gone. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her nails were unmanicured, and her face, free of its mask of makeup, looked tired but clear. She was no longer performing. She was working. As he watched, her supervisor, a brisk woman with a clipboard, came over and pointed out a mistake on the tray. Clarice listened, nodded, and immediately corrected it without a word of complaint or a flicker of resentment. There was a humility in the gesture that Arthur had never seen in her before. Their eyes met across the small expanse of the park. A dozen emotions flickered in her gaze: shame, recognition, surprise, and something else: acceptance. There was no plea, no demand. She simply gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned back to her work. Arthur nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the vast distance they had both traveled. He took his coffee and walked on, leaving her to her new life. He didn't know if she was on a path to true redemption or simply surviving, but he knew her journey was her own. Her downfall had not been his victory. It had been the natural consequence of a life lived without substance. His own peace had not come from her ruin, but from his own steadfast integrity. Richard Sterling had not fared as well. His attempt to meddle had exposed his own questionable financial ethics, triggering a minor audit that, while not ruinous, had cost him dearly in both money and reputation. His relationship with his daughter was strained, broken by his inability to rescue her and her resentment that he hadn't tried harder. He was an old lion, left with his pride but stripped of his power to command the world to his will. Later that evening, sitting in his study, Arthur looked again at the photograph of his grandfather. The postman's smile seemed to hold a universe of secrets, the greatest of which was the simple truth that a person's worth is not held in a bank or displayed in a home, but is carried within the heart and demonstrated through action. It is measured in the respect you give, the knowledge you share, and the quiet integrity with which you live your life. Arrogance builds castles on sand, but humility, patience, and wisdom build foundations on bedrock. Clarice had chased the glittering reflection on the water's surface, while he, guided by his grandfather, had inherited the deep, quiet treasure that lay beneath. What do you think? Is true wealth about what you have, or who you are? We all face moments where our character is tested, where we are underestimated or judged unfairly. Let us know in the comments below about a time you found strength in your own quiet integrity. Thank you for being with us on this journey. Remember to like this story if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more tales of justice, redemption, and the hidden power that lies within us all. Until next time, know your worth. even when others don't.